Dzień dobry, witam Państwa serdecznie.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome warmly on the second day of World on Focus, the Warsaw International Meetings. Yesterday, the conference was opened with a debate on the European model of life. Today, we'll go in depth on issues that are of no less importance than those general ones. Welcome on behalf of Heinrich Böll Foundation and a debate on an alliance for the climate. Can we save the planet? And if so, how? The only planet that we have. We're going to use Polish for the purposes of this debate, but we need to use the mic in order to register the whole debate. Plus, there are the interpreters. Importantly, they're interpreting mainly for the needs, for the purposes of the recording, but there are also listeners among the audience, as I see. So please remember about the mic. Let me not delay, and let me hand over to Piotr Trzaskowski, coordinator of Energy and Climate Program, who will host the debate.
Witam Państwa.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This morning at 8, I woke up to see you at this panel, and I thought to myself, oh my God, it's extremely early, it's going to be tough. But I had to be here since I'm the host. You didn't have to be here. And I'm the happier that you are here. I'm sure that you're here because you care about the topic. So let's not talk about basic issues like whether climate change is caused by man and whether we have to do anything about it. Let's rather focus on what and how to act. I hope that's what we're going to be focused on. Now, by way of a brief introduction on my part, looking at the Polish discussion on climate recently, I saw that it has sped up a lot. Early last year, the Minister of Energy said that the Ostrołęka power plant is going to be the last coal-fired unit to be built in Poland. Later, a few parties declared deadlines for Poland to go away from coal altogether. So the debate has moved from the question about whether we want to have a coal-based economy to the question concerning the deadline by which we want to drop coal. Later, we saw mass youth protests, the climate march, and I think these have been the biggest ecological protests in the Third Polish Republic's history. Plus, citizen disobedience examples have been observed, like they were focused on climate action, and I've seen that climate is one of the three most important topics for Poles. And yet, looking at CO2 emissions, CO2 being the most important greenhouse gas, they have been growing. They grew in 2018 by 3.5% in Poland. This is one of the worst results in the EU. Worldwide, there is also a lot of talk about the climate. Greta Thunberg started protests, gathered in September around 6 million people worldwide. This was the second biggest mass protest on one single issue right after the anti-war protests against the war in Iraq in 2003. Everybody seems to be talking about the climate. The new UN head often mentions the topic, has launched dedicated conferences. Pope Francis, David Attenborough have been talking about climate. David Attenborough has become the leader of the action against climate change, including also Leonardo DiCaprio. And yet emissions have been growing. The latest UN report of the UNEP Agency for Environment says that If we want to have a reduction in emissions that to be in line with the Paris Agreement, we would need a drop by 7.6% per year in emissions worldwide, starting from today till 2030. This is a drastic change, a drastic move away from the current situation. It seems that we need a very basic reflection about how we deal with the climate currently. Each of us knows how important a threat to our own life and the future generations, not to be mentioned, these changes are, and the changes that might be brought about that will be brought about if we do not change our behaviors. I recently read Economists for the Future letter, and I saw a sentence that I found very inspirational. It says, in the case of a climate crisis, winning slowly means defeat. Small reductions of emissions will not be helpful. Only big emissions will be necessary, and this is why we need a radical thinking through of the strategy. One idea would be creating new alliances and including new actors in the game. New actors have been emerging in the landscape, like Apple, Amazon. Big corporations have declared their decarbonization goals. Also, new alliances like City Business Climate Alliance have been brought about, including Paris and London. And the US, we are still in alliance, has united many representatives of business, religious organizations, cities, and native citizens of the US. The question is this the right way? Is this enough? Are this kind of alliances efficient, and what actors do we need to include? This is what I'd like to talk about with you in this very respectable group. Namely, starting from my left, Maria Świetlik, political anthropologist who works for workers' rights and global justice. She has worked in a number of NGOs and currently is involved in the climate camp. She is also a member of the National Commission of the trade union Inicjatywa Pracownicza of the board of the Rozruch Association. Also, Marek Szolc, municipal councillor of the city of Warsaw, vice chairperson of the Committee on Environmental Protection. Marek has become the president of the commission. He is a member of the Committee on Urban Planning and of the Committee on Infrastructure and Investment. Marek has been the initiator of the position taken by the Council of the City of Warsaw on the climate crisis. It was adopted recently. And the last but not least, Ewa Łabno-Falęcka, Director of Corporate Communication and External Affairs at Mercedes-Benz Poland. Ewa has a very rich curriculum vitae that I cannot enumerate all her experiences. Let me just tell you that, among others, she's a member of the Council of Superbrands and of the Congress Kobiet, a Women's Congress, and one of the initiators of the Association for Road Safety. So, as you can see, this panel represents varied sectors. We have businesses represented, public authorities, and trade unions, and bottom-up movements. So, let's talk. The first question I'd like to ask you is about the goal. Since to build alliances, we need to agree on which way we want to be headed. Please tell me. The institutions that you represent, what is their point of view on the goal? Should we decarbonize according to the Paris Agreement, that is, go down to zero in in 2050. Like IPCC says, the panel on climate change is at 50% in the next 11 years to come. Let's start with the goals. I don't know which hat I should put on, but let me start with the climate camp because it's simpler. Of course, climate camp is totally for decarbonization, including what you said in the introduction. Let me tell you that in detail we should precise that it's not people who are responsible, but speaking on behalf of the climate camp and my trade union, it's the particular social economic system that's to blame. So if we're talking from a global perspective of global justice, then it's not the whole world that should go down in emissions, since there are places where emissions are much lower and others where they are much higher. Thus, talking on behalf of the global justice movement, the goal would be for the wealthiest countries who emit the most and who are responsible for emissions in the global south countries, since they have brought the situation about through their business activity supported by states and the EU. These goals in our global north part of the world should be much more ambitious. If I'm not mistaken, the EU is the fourth source of poisoning of the world. So if we even if we achieve those 8%, we won't achieve the goals in terms of reduction. And even if those less polluting countries reach those rates, that will be not enough. So let's not say people. Instead, let's talk about part of the people. Those that have caused the production and that have participated and the benefits benefited from the high level of production of goods, which translates into high consumption in those societies. And then going back to your question, certainly for the climate camp, we are the right way to go is a radical move away from coal. And in our opinion, the 2050 horizon is not our dream, it's rather a result of a rational thinking, because it seems that we won't make it earlier. If that was possible, it would be great. But from the point of view of the trade unions, the picture is slightly more complicated, because they represent the employers and employees of sectors that are dependent on the emissions to a certain extent as of today. So we're talking about the employees of the energy sector and others, less obvious sectors like steel production industry, all those that are high energy sectors, energy consuming sectors. You might have heard that one of such big facilities, Steelworks, has been closing down one of their facilities, their factories. That's because steel production is ever less profitable in Europe, and because the emission-causing energy prices are growing. So it's not so easy to say for the trade unions that the best way to go is to close down everything and just throw people out. So from the vantage point of trade unions, it's obvious that we are all victims of climate change, and we are going to continue so. Thus, obviously, these goals are important for us, and yet we don't want the 90s history to repeat itself. You might remember what happened in Wałbrzych. That was an example of shocking decarbonization of the region. Although the goals were not about the environment protection, in any case, the result was closing down the facility and leaving people on their own. You might remember the pictures from that time. It looked like 19th century Łódź, early capitalist situations where children were digging coal with their bare hands because they had no means to live. We don't want that to repeat, and we tend to lack imagination. These seem fantastic scenarios. It sounds like Mad Max, and yet this is what awaits us if decarbonization is done overnight and people are left on the street. You might remember the program in Silesia where miners were given 40,000 zlotys and left on their own, and in order to train them to be business people. And that was an absurd idea. So now we're talking about such a path to move away from coal that would provide the costs not to be incurred by the weakest, that is the employees and especially women who in this kind of sectors, these emission generating sectors, are weakest positioned because they earn less and they're the least talked about, and they are found in the most difficult situation in the case of factories being closed down, because you know the realities when you're 50 years old and you have to find a new job, change your profession. You might receive 500 zlotys from the state, but obviously that's not enough to live on. So yes, for the climate camp, let's move away from coal as soon as possible, with direct costs being incurred to the businesses, with a strong policy of the state support of that program. And for trade unions, yes, let's do it with adequate support to the weakest ones who might be the victims of such a solution.
So just a second, I need to take this thing. Well, so getting down from the very global level, I would go down to the local one. We had the example of how it can look like top-down, so let's do bottom-up now. Well, Warsaw, vis-à-vis its decarbonization policy, well, I should talk about the capital city of Warsaw, because I know it best and I can really speak about it here. Perhaps otherwise, well, Warsaw has already made certain commitments concerning emission reduction. Warsaw have already committed to meet together with the EU agenda to meet the 2020, so the 20% of CO2 reduction, 20% energy use reduction, and 20% of renewables in the energy mix. We'll learn next year whether the targets have been met. And you know, the result that I got during my first question, because it was really the first thing that I asked the city about, so how are you doing with the goals implementation? Well, the responses were not terribly optimistic. I wouldn't like to criticize anybody before the deadline, but it seems that some of the targets are not going to be met, and it's not a good thing, because Warsaw will, and I hope it will do it very quickly, other ambitious plans. Trzaskowski has already informed us that Warsaw will join the new mayor's agreement. One of the areas is 40% of emissions till 2030, so we've got some clear political declaration on what the city is going to do. 40% till 2030 in the face of the scale of the crisis is not a small step, especially that scientists say we have to accelerate decarbonization plans. So Warsaw shall be ambitious, and perhaps soon we'll be talking about it to the mayor and in the Warsaw City Council. I will really ask everybody to be more ambitious, because unfortunately decarbonization globally is not going terribly well, and scientists say that we are heading towards a greenhouse effect of 3.56 degrees. So this is going to be a catastrophe, and we think that will be passing the grave whistling. Well, Warsaw as a city, vis-à-vis its policy, will have to develop a really serious strategy, including transportation, energy strategy, and also changing the life in the city, because everyone understands that emission reduction is a terrible task. When you compare Warsaw against other cities, well, cities in the west of Europe are struggling with two problems: how to eliminate emissions from the transportation sector, and this is the biggest problems for us, and how to eliminate emissions in the power sector. And here the situation depends on the country, but still Warsaw is greatly supplied energy-wise with two big coal-burning blocks, Warsaw, Świetlik, and also for years nothing really has been done. There was absolute failure of the system. So then, as a consequence, in 2019, still around 20,000 households use carbon or other fossil fuels, even waste to produce thermal energy. So I would say that advancement in this area is most needed. Without doubt, the long-term objective for Warsaw, as for other cities and other states, should be climate neutrality, the latest 2050. And honestly, it should be achieved earlier. If the authorities of Warsaw are afraid to take this challenge, it might be a signal that we have to think well about choosing authorities that will be able to say that before 2050 emissions in Warsaw should just disappear. Well, this is a subject that's going to be the key, because there's great social pressure on the execution of this goal. And well, I won't talk now about the issue of whether Polish local authorities have the resources and the power to execute such policies. Well, we have to remember that local authorities, which very often are much more ambitious in greenhouse emissions reductions, dependent on the state, have very different resources to use. And I would say, so perhaps let's leave it. You could talk at great length about it. However, I'm putting here a big question mark. It's just a signal for you. Is there good will centrally to give local authorities tools for making the transformation a fact? Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Well, I have a single remark to make before I talk about the targets. Well, Piotr, we all say it. Without doubt, we have to, and so on and so forth. We are in a university campus Saturday early in the morning, so you must know a lot about the subject that's being tackled today. However, I will make you a little bit sad now. We all know that it's necessary. No, it's not a common knowledge. I know it because I work in a company that builds a factory, and I talk to people in Lower Silesia. And it's not so that this mindset is common. We may have this impression when we talk to each other. However, you still have to continue the efforts. And whenever I talk to the production crew in our company, there's already 650 people. Well, you shouldn't make quotes here. However, in Homo Deus, you remember humankind overcome wars, poverty, and hunger. Well, still there are certain conflicts here and there, epidemics. However, the three big nightmares of the humanity have been overcome. And what are the goals for us now? First of all, to be happy, and the second one is to live forever. Okay, just to live longer. And it was all perfect till the moment when at the horizon the climate catastrophe appeared. And yes, things have to be changed now. When I use this language in talking to the employees, it's just like, aha. So it seems that we all know there is the UN panel and we make all these quotes. However, I guess that our communication has to be, I shouldn't say simplified, but rather we have to use specific examples to make people aware of things. This is the first remark I wanted to make, and now the second one. Obviously, I will tell you how Daimler, a corporation that employs 300,000 people around the world and produces millions of passenger vehicles, trucks and delivery vans. Well, we have an objective, and it's called, well, every corporation has its vision, yes? So we call it emission and accident-free autonomous driving. So our aspiration is to make our fleet emission-free, so that we have no accidents and our vehicles should be autonomic. We have a nice acronym: connected, autonomous, shared economy, and electric. So zero emission. Well, whether these are lithium-ion batteries or cells or hydrogen drive, the point is that we want to be CO2 neutral. And my corporation has a very ambitious plan. We are not waiting till 2050 as the EU climate pact requires, but we say that in 2039 is the time when we'll be carbon-free neutral. 2039. Somebody may say, well, 20 years will be elsewhere, nobody will check on us. Well, but to achieve it, we are taking specific steps, and we are also member of Global Compact, which we treat very seriously, and Kamil Wierzchowski is always very happy when I say Global Compact. You know what it is. This is the business commitment. This is the commitment of the United Nations business and civil citizens. It's very important for us. So on the one hand, we have legislation. The EU says next year all corporations have to have mean CO2 emissions at the level of 95 grams per kilometer. So this is like 2-liter engine, 4-cylinder, horsepower around 200. And you know that such producers as Mercedes, Audi, BMW, well, yes, we also have V8, V6, V4, and emissions are today are at the level of 100, 105 grams. A lot to be done still, but gradually we're limiting it for sure. Well, I'm not going to talk about percentages here. I just want to say that next year the little micro smart vehicle, which is for 2, for 4 passengers, and also there is a soft top, well, good for young people. Well, so the whole family of vehicles will be electrical, and Daimler says till 2025 we'll have 15% of pure electric vehicles, 25% of electrified, so hybrid vehicles, and the rest slowly. Basically, as for public transportation, it's between 9 and 40% of greenhouse emissions globally. In cities like Warsaw, where with this streets are not washed, cleaned, roads are not cleaned, and all the particles from braking shoes and tires settle on the asphalt, and each vehicle makes them jump up into the air, and you get all these P2 and P10. Well, somebody told me that in Warsaw you have to live from the 3rd level up to enjoy fresh air. So I just want to tell you that I'm not saying it's easy for a corporation like ours, and well, the last word. So we've got the target 2039. We have to lower emissions, and the third thing that's terribly important, because everyone talked about transportation as the scapegoat. Everyone thinks that this vehicle is the end product, but the vehicle starts with buying raw materials. They run it the production, and at the end you have the vehicle and the raw materials. The supply chain is very complex, and now we have just signed a pact in which we commit that we will not only produce low-emission vehicles, will not only build factories that have zero emissions, because a new Mercedes plant in Jawor that's going to employ 2,000 people and will produce several hundreds of car engines and batteries is fully renewable. this is the first facility of this kind in Poland. You can do it. If you're interested, you can do it. Simply the law allows for it, and people just fear the risk, and they don't have the imagination to do it. And as for the complex supply chain, you have to know that a company like Mercedes, Audi, BMW, we have several dozens of thousands of suppliers. Some of them are far away from the production site indeed. And when you talk about electrical vehicles, you need what? Lithium, iron, cobaltum. It is very interesting because you only have it in the Republic of Congo, which is not so very democratic. And now Daimler has 700 engineers that do nothing more but travel the world and check the supply chain, because we want it ecologically and socially sustainable. This is really a very big challenge, because when you have 20, 30,000 suppliers and sub-suppliers, please tell me how to monitor and how to control and audit everyone. So at this point, I just wanted to ask you another question. Well, I do know that Mercedes has ambitious objectives, but you can define it through emissions from your own production facilities, by reducing emissions in vehicles produced by you as well. But the production ecosystem, the whole chain of supplies, is much broader, and it seems to be beyond your control, even when you are such a big corporation. No, I just said controlling things is difficult, but I'm not saying it's impossible. So things are under control. So you say it's possible to reduce emissions to zero from mines, that get the indispensable elements for the production of a vehicle, or reducing emissions in steelworks. These things are terribly difficult, and I guess that without the right social and economic context and political will, Mercedes will not deliver on this promise to go further. So there are questions about mobility fashions. People don't believe that with individual mobility at the level of states of Western Europe, so the number of kilometers covered by us annually, well, if the whole world took this route, you would not be able to protect the climate, because it will be associated with a great demand for resources to produce vehicles which, well, even if they are electrical, and if we assume that electrical vehicles are emission-free, which as of today, is still an illusion. So the ecosystem is terribly complex, and it seems that Mercedes by themselves will not be able to deliver it. So my question is, who else Mercedes would like to join in the cooperation, so that the ecosystem in which Mercedes works makes the production really emission-free, so that vehicles are really zero emission? Well, a very brief answer. We have this tendency. We think that the future will be just like now, but more. The future of Warsaw will be just the same amount of vehicles, but electrical ones. No, not at all. I tell you the case. Above all, if the vehicles are connected and autonomous, then you will have less of them. Why? Because today, I mean, on average, a person living in Warsaw will leave their vehicle in the garage and it stays there for 8 hours. The vehicle was produced, CO2 emissions, and 95% of the life cycle of the vehicle is the time spent in a garage, unless you are a sales rep. And now please imagine autonomous vehicles, and it's happening now. There are cities that have certain districts, well, when the law will not allow for it. But if vehicles are autonomous, you will just have an application. I mean, you press a button, a vehicle comes to your place, takes you to work, and this is the technical vision. It's not a vision. It's not a vision. It's taking place now. But the question is how to get to this point. I'm just trying to explain. So for sure, we will not see individual mobility at the scale that we have today towards shared mobility, because if it is autonomous vehicle and it can transport 100 of people there and back, not just one commuter, then the number of vehicles will be seriously reduced. And at least here, Europe, China, the US won't produce the vehicles at such a scale, but we have other patterns of mobility. You hear about micro-mobility, so all the personal transportation devices, they are connected in our mobility system. And people say that vehicle producers provide mobility, not products. So we have micro-mobility, and recently you've heard about right-size mobility. So the transportation of the appropriate, say, size. And I will say that Mercedes in '97 already started with electrical smart on the market, but it was too early. At that time, nobody talked about problems with traffic jams in cities, no parking spaces and stuff. And it's smart, we've lost a lot because that product really jumped the gun. And today, if you are in Brussels or Rome, a vehicle that has 2.5 meters and its weight is 600 kilo, this is the solution in the framework of right-size mobility. So if they are connected, autonomous and free of emissions, if you have any technology, it's a subject for a separate discussion, a very interesting one, because companies also wouldn't like to have any more cobalt, so they are looking for potassium and sodium solutions. And vehicle companies, 58% of R&D comes from the motor business, so we are also looking for new solutions. So we've heard the vision. Marek, you will be given the floor in a second, but I have a question to Marysia. We heard about the vision of the industry that wants a change and is willing within its activity to determine and execute decarbonization vision. Is it a partner for you, for an activist? Do you see a platform for cooperation with them? Do you think that your ambitions and targets overlap enough to make an alliance and fight together? Well, yes. Well, obviously, it's a very tricky question because we may say we agree at certain level, to a certain degree. And I think what we had in your words, maybe it was not so explicit in what I said. However, we need certain legal solutions that would support the transformation. So you may say that at a general level we can agree, no problem. But then when you go to the practical level, I have an impression that we live in very different realities. So for me, it's just very nice to hear about smart for 4 passengers or 2 passengers. However, I might be vicious and ask you, and people working in your factory, can they afford buying such vehicles? And these solutions, are these solutions for the, say, working world? So the vision, is it a vision to solve problems of people that live in big cities, well-developed, having good salaries, and it's still not a dominating part of the Polish society? And my colleagues from trade unions that work, okay, at your competitor, but I think that conditions are quite comparable. Well, we don't have an implant commission in Mercedes. They will never ever buy smart. They will rather drive a junk with a diesel engine because they can't afford anything else. So I just would like to bring us back to reality and the story, you know, who will enjoy the great change and who will remain at the margin and will have to pay the price of the increase of fuel or energy prices. So this is quite hard for me today to develop such alliances. And also when we talk about legal changes, I think the law should be much stricter. However, when I think about where corporations, car corporations are today asked for lobbying, I have an impression that they are lobbying for something very opposite. They are lobbying for slowing down the application of certain policies, whereas we would like to lobby, well, our resources are pro-mile of the lobbying resources that business can have. So we would support something very different. We would like the state to think more about the future of the people that would incur the biggest cost of the transformation. So I just would like to be so open and positive. However, I guess that a precondition for the discussion would be to, I'm very sorry, perhaps it's a bit vulgar, but as they say, quit your bullshit. Let's talk about what really happens. Let's not talk about visions, but where realistically the money goes. There's no money in reality that would support in a tangible way people that are not so well off. No money from business and money from, well, Mercedes. They do produce the beautiful little sweet cars, but they also produce SUVs. Well, electrical SUV seems to be such an aberration that, well, it's just a joke. It is a joke. We are saying that we need reduction of the consumption, so
if you want to reduce production, then we need to agree that we need growth, that is reversing the paradigm of continuous growth as a necessary element. We're being choked with that growth, and it might be the death of us at the end of the day. It seems to me that there is no sensible idea to modify business models in a reasonable way, because the sharing economy seems to be a nice idea, but I don't think it's a solution for small towns in Poland, that is for the majority of Poles in the horizon of 2050. These are ideas emerging in the Silicon Valley, and they're based on nice ideas about the shared good, etc. But everybody knows that all the profits from the so-called sharing economy is consumed by an ever richer group of few. We have not dealt with hunger worldwide, because we still have over 1 billion people suffering from hunger, and we have a number of other issues that are much more important than it would seem to Google and a number of other Silicon Valley companies. Maria doesn't see such a possibility for an alliance. These conditions are very wide, of course, and one of the key conditions is making this transition a just one, assuring such a transformation that would not be beneficial to injustice, to an ever-growing injustice, an unjust sharing of the benefits, and ensuring the weakest ones to enjoy the benefits of the transition. So let me ask Marek, to what extent are the public authorities ready to play the role of the moderator in order to make sure that this transition that we are discussing on the panel, and about which we agree on this panel that is necessary, to what extent are the public authorities ready to play that role and make sure that the transition can take place? Well, I have to go beyond my level of public authorities, since you know what the competencies, what the remit is of the Council of Warsaw, and I have to talk in a wider context. It seems to me that our current situation is the result of the decisions made by public authorities. This is, as you said, Maria, we have an economy based on exponential growth, a growth that boils down to transforming an ever bigger amount of natural resources into products. So I'm very happy that you are so precise about controls of your suppliers and sub-suppliers, because I know another German producer of cars, since you know that Germany produces very nice cars. When I asked them the same question, I learned that they are introducing blockchain solution to make sure that the leather in their car, used in their cars is derived from happy cows, while such companies should rather make sure that their cobalt is not dug up by a 10-year-old in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Making sure and understanding very well the flow of resources between various sectors of the economy, since we're not only talking about a climate crisis, we're also talking about an ecological crisis, the climate crisis being just a slice of that. It's an element of a transformation going a step forward, but initiated by the public authorities, which created a financial system in which the basic element, that is the money, is purely fiduciary, and it is produced as a debt produced by financial institutions, and this system means that we need ever more money, which is produced by ever-growing use, extraction and use of natural resources, and all that is not reflected at all in the GDP that is always quoted by politicians when they're boasting their achievements. Still, most politicians are controlled based on GDP. Sometimes the question is asked about who was the beneficiary of that growth and that GDP, but very rarely are the politicians asked about whether this growth was possibly produced based on an exploitation of people and countries in a different part of the world. So it is my belief that it is strong public institutions and political institutions are the ones to initiate the transition, because it cannot be done bottom up. Trade unions are not the stakeholder that would be capable of such changes. It is not the companies, not the businesses that are dependent on their stakeholders, shareholders, unless a political decision is made that we have to redefine our priorities, that we care more about development rather than growth, unless we decide that we need to create a regulatory environment that makes it possible to finally live within our means in terms of physical limitations of the planet, because this is what we're talking about. Unless that takes place, I'm skeptical about such changes possibly taking place. This has been looked into in detail because economic models have been created that are alternative to what is widely used currently, and I encourage you to look into such propositions. What do the public authorities need to get from other stakeholders, business, society, trade unions, in order to be effective in this? The public authorities, politicians need strong pressure, because politicians act under strong pressure. We have political realities in which most politicians only will take action when they are strongly pressured. There are certain countries where there are politicians who have the leadership skills to make difficult decisions and really become the leaders of change in their local communities, but there are few such people. Let's just look at a few examples. Look at how important the decision is in every city about the right kind of mobility model and how controversial that is. I do see some room for technological solutions you talked about, and yet I'm not such an optimist in terms of technology. I believe that the need for mobility in Warsaw means a growth of public transportation combined with bringing up barriers for individual transportation, because you might not believe me, but most citizens, or most dwellers of Warsaw, reach their workplace by bus. It's not trams, it's not subway, and only 8% use their car on a daily basis to go to work, and yet the city is full of cars. It's blocked by traffic jams. And yet this group is such effective in their pressure on the Council of Warsaw that its activities are not in line with the ambitious climate goals that have been set. So, in brief, it's about pressure, pressure, and pressure once again. If we have a 50,000 strong protest in Warsaw for reorganizing city mobility, I assure you that decisions will be made, and only then. I would like to comment on what Maria Świetlik said. For starters, I am very much surprised by your point of view, because it's like between the business environment and social movements, as if there was a glass wall between them. Trade union participation stands at around 7%, while in Germany it's around 80%. Daimler, like most German companies, have the participation rule, which means that the supervisory board of Daimler AG has to represent in 50% the employees, the team, its employees of the company who sit as members of the supervisory board. The most important meetings for my management board are not those with shareholders, they are the ones with the trade unionists. Recently, Audi said that they have to let go 9,500 people. That was a result of weeks of dialogue with trade unions, during which it was reflected upon what can be done about those people, how they can be helped, because the production of electrical cars requires fewer employees. So trade unionists are for us a partner in every decision that we make, according to the rule of participation. In Poland, we have no such rule. We're still waiting for that. And yet there is no glass wall. We are really in dialogue with representatives of our teams. It's not a huge company, corporation, where there's just the boss and they talk to nobody. It's a 250,000 strong group. Now, talking about mobility, we have different kinds of mobility, and like it was said, in Berlin, the resolution has been made for the number of parking slots will be reduced by 10% year over year. If you did that in Warsaw, a revolution would break out. There is the same problem in Berlin, but apparently, since there's urban sprawl, city centers are too expensive in terms of land for simply parking slots. This is something we're thinking about and bearing in mind. And the mentioned Jawór factory is one where we proposed for local authorities to increase the attractiveness of the region. The first question we were asked about, not about the salary, rather about possibilities of commuting to work. We talked to the starost, to the marshal, to the voivodeship, because it's not only about us, it's a transportation network for all the employers in the region. And there's a number of these. And after 2 years, we did not reach a conclusion. So we launched our own network of transportation, which is a free of charge solution. This is to comment on what you said about these bloodthirsty companies that only focus on profit for shareholders. I had one more point, but I don't remember anymore. Now, let me open the floor to questions. Do we have a mobile mic? Right, we have a first question. Good morning, Jarosław Kusznier. I work at Warsaw University, and I'm a car blogger. Jeremy Clarkson said that we have a climate problem. He came back from Vietnam a few days ago, where he saw that his favorite lake dried out. I have a question to Mariam about how do we introduce decarbonization if energy consumption grows exponentially. Therefore, renewable energy will not will not replace the energy that we consume at a global level, especially if we move to electrical cars. A question to Ewa: is the future electrical? Because Harvard scientists have calculated that the life cycle of electrical cars has more impact on and higher CO2 emissions and impact on environment than traditional cars. So if you take into account the production process, they are more ecologically friendly than electrical ones. Also, if you take into account the lithium-ion batteries, due to their production, we will have a large problem, environmental crisis in the near future. Now, another question for Ewa. Toyota has adopted a program in line with the Kyoto Protocol. Hyundai yearly annual budget is higher than of many countries. How do you see the fight for a better climate in the motor industry in the future? Other questions, commentaries before we hand over to the panelists? After a round of 3 more questions, we will refer back to our panelists. Good morning, Michał Martinez, a University of Warsaw student. I have 2 remarks for Ewa. First, I'd like to defend public transportation in Biała Łęka because it's very good, very speedy and pleasant. Secondly, I don't understand the vision of car sharing 100% because my impression is that if we're to use 100% our cars so that they are not parked uselessly, I think that it would be enough to use taxis or other such solutions with a driver where we're given a lift by a professional. Car sharing seems more complicated in terms of legal issues and in terms of infrastructure. So for cars to be used to the maximum, taxis or Uber-based solutions seem to solve the problem. That's all on my part. The second row, please. I wanted to ask about the 8% of Warsaw dwellers who use their cars. How do you define Warsaw in terms of territory in this statistics? Plus, who goes by car? Who commutes by car? Are we talking about company cars? Who generates that traffic? And a last remark, 3rd row, Piotr Buras, CFR. A question for Ewa, referring to what Marek Szolc said about the need to reduce individual mobility, car mobility. This seems to be a basic assumption in terms of the goals that we're discussing. Is there a structural contradiction between the interest of the motor industry that so far has been based on individual mobility, which has been the core of their offer? Is there a contradiction with this interest and what is postulated by Marek Szolc? This concept of mobility indeed is rather limited to big cities, and still that's an important area, as mentioned by Ewa. Or is there an attempt at building a bridge between these two realities, these two drives?
Well, I shall start because the first question was addressed to me, how to limit the consumption. Well, I usually try to, think not about consumption limitation, but production limitation. Thank you for the question, and I have so many ideas on how to limit the production. First of all, you have to make production costs realistic. And, today what we are witnessing, all the climate changes, this is, the fact that we say it only today and talk about it now is the fact that the actual production costs were hidden and not covered. Every production is associated to some extent, and Marek talked about it, with environmental costs. And the environmental costs basically are not in any way covered by the business. Well, for a couple of years, various policies have been implemented to sort of link the two things, but we are so very far from making the cost look more realistic. If the business were forced to pay real costs of production and usage of vehicles, because, when you talk, and it's just my question, when we say Daimler shall be neutral, what does it really mean? Because if Daimler produces vehicles that are still producing fumes, rather, are they taking account of the costs of individual use or public transportation? Well, the point is, we mainly talk about individual transportation by transportation of goods is great and still growing cost. Well, today you mentioned the share of transportation in overall emissions, which is above 10%, but it's one of the most quickly growing factors. Very soon, international transportation will be responsible for around 30% of emissions if we accept overproduction, because in fact this is the problem, not consumption. Consumption is just the effect of production. So then we also talk about high costs of international transportation, and this is the cobble that you have to deliver from Congo, and all these things, production chains have been arranged in such a way that they are very long and not rational from the point of view of environmental costs. However, these costs are not covered from the budget. We all are going to pay for these costs in the framework of the climate catastrophe. So this is going to be the first thing I would suggest to do. The costs of demolition of nature should be transferred on businesses. Salaries. Well, you gave examples of Germany. There's very different trade union law than 60%, here 8%. It's not just the fact that we try less, but we have a very different system. Well, Germany was a state, or still is, caring state, and since the 40s or right after the World War II, they had social partners, trade unions very much involved, whereas Poland has assumed the American model. Success for the last 30 years makes it impossible to form really strong trade union movement, and we have continuous advancement in demolition. So the Polish trade union law and the right to strike is very bad indeed, and afterwards it translates into, we would like to be a member of the supervisory board. Nobody invited us, and the law doesn't require it, or the culture doesn't require it. And back to the question. So first of all, environmental costs must be made realistic. Taxation, because, what's the role of the public authority? A double role they have. So first things in making policies and execution of policies, and then the redistribution. So the public authority should have any kind of interest and a possibility of redistribution. But to do it first, they have to collect taxes. As we know, the tax from corporations dropping down, and profits from corporate tasks equals the cost that the country invests in supporting businesses. So it's just like putting money from the right pocket to the left pocket, and really nothing remains for the society.
Ale takie piękne pytanie dostałam. No i oczywiście prawne wymuszanie.
And obviously forcing business to take steps, just as we had this response that political authorities will do something for the society because they will do something for themselves without any law. And in the same way, business shall execute the things that they are forced to do. So business operates in a certain system that requires from it making profits. And let's make the profit equation realistic. Well, two short answers. I think the first one was really about whether we'll be able to produce enough energy to electrify transportation. Well, opinions vary, and perhaps you will be able to shed some more light on it. But very many research centers say, well, in projecting the total electrification, because we are also talking about electrification of industry. It's not easy to make electrical steelworks or cement works, so the amounts of power that are to be produced are really incredible. Electrification of thermal systems as well. Yes, so we are really talking about, well, I know a report that said that Poland fully electrified till 2050 and neutral climatically shall produce twice as much of electricity as it's doing today using renewables, which is a big challenge. And here I would put a question mark. Poland, as a state, will it be able to develop an energy policy to meet the requirements? And electrical vehicles will have an important role, as, for example, energy storage devices. Many people say that electrical vehicles should be, give back the energy to the grid when the energy is needed. And, well, a question about transportation. Warsaw is examining well the proportions in transportation, the share of trips on specific modes of transportation. 6% of trips in Warsaw by public transportation. That's a result that many Western cities are jealous of because they are not able to meet the same level. I don't really want to try to think how hopeless a place to live in Warsaw would be if the index was 40%. And this is just a result of great investments of Warsaw. If I'm not wrong, next year we earmarked over 3.5 billion zloty for public transportation at the time when profits from tickets is just 1 billion. And now something about financial issues. Our transformation of mobility would be much faster if local authorities were not fiscally pressurized by the central government. If in the policy people could know what the money goes to, because in Poland the debate on the profits of local authorities is hopeless. People have very reasonable expectations from local authorities vis-à-vis public policies. But when you start talking about, like, we don't have the money because the government arbitrarily decides what share, how big the personal income tax is, how much of it goes to the city, how much to the central government, then it's hard because people don't really want to hear about it. They just want to have a public service. And for us, year to year, it's more of a challenge to finance such a service because we have wrong redistribution system in Warsaw. I do agree that cities should, but I guess that we should not talk about this aspect. But this mechanism is hopeless. I would just say that financial distribution policies have to be changed. And to answer the question, the Warsaw traffic study showed that only 8% of Warsawians use their vehicles every day, 20 use occasionally. 60% of impurities are generated by transportation, and the fact that Warsaw streets look the way they are, it's 500,000 of vehicles that every day enter Warsaw from outside. Why do they enter Warsaw? Because my opinion is, in 2003, the government of certain man who is today in the European Parliament eliminated solutions, and as a consequence, through very intensive periods of investments, we had an El Dorado for developers in Warsaw, and unfortunately unfortunately. Well, this is a challenge. It's hard to say how to solve it because we've already constructed hopeless space. We constructed a city that's dispersed on the Mazovian plain as coffee from a tilted cup, and this infrastructure will remain here for a long time, and it's going to be a gigantic challenge to achieve decarbonization. Today we cannot pull down houses and make people move into the center of Warsaw. So you can't really demolish houses built around Warsaw and to have them more efficient energy and transportation-wise. Taxpayers have every right to expect public services, but then it's a gigantic problem because we are not able to have tramways constructed everywhere. Yes, we are checking, we are analyzing as the city itself. We are not analyzing municipalities around central Warsaw. The data from those agglomerations is just the information on how many vehicles come in and out of the central Warsaw district. Yes. Well, because we are out of time, and I would like to 500,000 every day, 500,000 of vehicles every day enter Warsaw from outside. And if you could explain when our panel is closed, then we'll be able to close the panel with a smaller delay, because we still have to give the floor to Ewa. I'll try very quickly. Well, first of all, it's very interesting because our discussion is very impressionistic. We come from different walks of life, but the first conclusion is it's not a matter of business against trade unions or business against social organizations. When I established the Global Road Safety Partnership, everyone thought that safety of traffic in Poland is the responsibility of police. And for 15 years, we worked hard to make people change their mind. It's not police who's responsible, it's the government, the citizens, NGOs, and so on and so forth. And after 15 years, and there was also the World Bank and the National Council, everything. So I would say the climate is even worse. It's just like traffic. It's not so that police is responsible, commission is responsible, or somebody specifically is responsible. An anecdote, a short one. During an economic forum in Krynica, I was at a panel on making Polish universities more attractive. By education, I'm a teacher. I started my work at the Jagiellonian University. That's why I love universities. And at the panel, there was the mayor of Nowy Sącz town. He complained that Nowy Sącz is sort of cut out transportation-wise. In Krakow, there's a lot of leisure and culture, whereas in Nowy Sącz, there are no parking lots and the universities are not attractive for students. I asked him, have you ever been to Cambridge, Oxford? There are no parking lots there. So look, it is not so that the university has to be good and attract students. The president of the mayor of Nowy Sącz town says, I have no parking space, so students don't come to me. So it's easier to make fusion reactions rather than to change humans' minds. And being a citizen and living here in Warsaw, I just wonder why parking in Warsaw, in the center, costs 3 zloty per hour, whereas the whole weekend is for free. And recently I was in Berlin Saturday, and just in Krakow even, yes. On Saturday, 10 to 12 hours. Why don't we have it in Warsaw? Because everyone believes that parking in the center of Warsaw is just birthright. It's just like the right that we have to pure water and air. And it's not true. When my colleagues come to Warsaw, they love it, because you can park nearly like everywhere. So it's not so that each of us works for a corporation. We are all human beings, and we also suffer when cars are too numerous. And as for the batteries, will the future be electrified? Well, 3 words. I will say future will be emissions free. And I always give this example. I don't know whether you know the share if the car weight, that the weight of the battery responds to. So if the car weighs, let's take the SUV that you talked about. Well, customers shout that they want to have even more SUVs. So the weight is 1.5 ton. What is the weight of the battery? What do you think? No, it's not that bad, but 1/3. So let's imagine a battery for Audi e-tron or IQC Mercedes 600, 650 kilo. What is the weight of conventional engine of a very, with fused loop, nitrogen oxides eliminated? What is the weight? 4-cylinder, 204 horsepower, being produced in Poland already. 112. And now I want to demonstrate to you how difficult it is for the industry. On the one hand, we have to adjust. On the other hand, Daimler spends 7 billion euro annually. It's more than the whole Polish science to find a different way, to go away from lithium and iron. We talked about a solid body battery, maybe hydrogen, or perhaps in cities in 20 years' time we'll have magnetic walking paths like in Dubai, and we won't have any vehicle. So we are thinking about different scenarios. If I showed you today, it's impossible. How, according to our vision, the city of the future would look like? There we have truly emission-free vehicles and without the driver. You talked about taxis, and there won't be any need of this kind. And if you are in Stuttgart, if you have the right Mercedes application, you go to a museum of Mercedes, you press a button, and the vehicle will find a parking space by itself. You go out, you press the button, it comes for you. And it's not a fairy tale. It happens today, because we think that it's a remote future. And now the city looks really happy. As Charles Montgomery says, it's a smart city. And if the authorities of Berlin can eliminate 10% of parking spaces annually, and it's not so that everybody loves it, on the other hand, you have people that are sick. Senior autonomic vehicles are a response. We are a aging population. We will not have to make our driving licenses anymore. My daughter, she lived in London in Great Britain, and she's the only person in the group that has a driving license. Nobody has a driving license there. In America, for the first time, less than 70% of 18-year-olds. Well, the very first thing that you did when you turn an adult in America, you got your driving license. Now young people don't have it. And these are, on one hand, you have legislation. On the other hand, you have social movements and still some common sense, because slowly, like clean water, pure air. Well, if I have a big vehicle with 1,000 horsepower, if I can't breathe and I can't get anywhere with my vehicle because of traffic jams, so we don't have the glass ceiling, and it's perhaps maybe that's the time when we can close. So we have to talk, and thank you for the discussion, because I'm also learning about your mindset. So it's good to talk. Thank you for the conversation. All right, so we have managed to determine certain things. We have agreed that we have similar objectives among certain progressive actors. Alliances are possible, but very often with very ambitious requirements, and the public authority has a very important role in making these conditions in the context of social inclusivity satisfied, and the public authority needs a social pressure to do anything towards this objective. Thank you very much for the conversation. Thank you, panelists. Thank you for the questions.